everybody, Lisa here. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to Tarot Memoirs. This week we are looking at the Hierophant. And this is probably the one I was the most dubious about, but I've gained some interesting knowledge this week that I am excited to share with you all, and definitely some perspectives that have changed the way that I view this card, which I think is really cool. So I hope you will join me as I go through all of this information and share some images of the cards and some personal stories. Please remember, if you enjoy this series, that you are welcome to share your personal memoirs relating to this card, either in the comments down below if you are so comfortable, or on the Supportive Tarot Facebook group, or I invite you also to consider looking at some of the journal prompts that I'm offering each week at the end of the video, and I'll also have them in the description box down below for some personal journey work if you're following along but want to keep your journey more private. So with that said, let's jump right into it. So I'm actually going to start, I'm still going to start with 78 Degrees of Wisdom this week. So this is again Rachel Pollack's book. And this had like a long section on the Hierophant. So it was 4.5 pages, maybe a little bit longer. Oh, and it was dense. I had a hard time in sections, not just like highlighting half a page. And I was like, that doesn't serve a purpose. So I'm going to try to jump right into the meaty bits and just give you a general idea of what this book was going for with its meaning. So going the more traditional route, there is definitely the upright meaning in this book talks about structure and learning. So there's the structure of the Emperor, which is more related to almost like government and power and authority, that kind of authority. And then the structure of the Hierophant is more about religion and tradition, and even in some cases dogma. Now, the first thing that jumped out at me when I started to read this book was this line, which just mind blown. The name Hierophant belonged to the high priest of the Greek Eleusinian mysteries. The Greek Eleusinian mysteries, I had to Google this to remind myself, even though I totally knew this. It was just somewhere in my hindbrain, like locked up. The Greek Eleusinian mysteries is the mystery surrounding the descent of Persephone into the underworld, something that we'll probably revisit. We visited slightly in the High Priestess, and we'll probably revisit again at some point. I have to think if we will or not. But for sure, that's what those Eleusinian mysteries are. So the Hierophant is the name of the high priest that would conduct or teach those mysteries. So that was really an interesting correlation that I never really knew. I don't think I knew the origin of the word or the term before. So that was kind of a cool aha moment for me. So Rider-Waite describes his card as or I guess it's Arthur Waite. Is it Arthur Waite? I just called him Rider-Waite. That's the name of the pack. Anyways, Mr. Waite. We're going to call him Mr. Waite because I have no idea. Mr. Waite describes his card as symbolizing the outer way of churches and dogma, but his use of the mystery term, Hierophant, suggests another interpretation, one more favored by those who see the tarot as a secret doctrine of occult practices rather than a more general embodiment of human patterns. So I thought that was a really interesting little tidbit there. There's also a piece here about how this trump thus signifies initiation into a secret doctrine, such as the various orders and lodges which flourished around the turn of the century. So that gave me like a really interesting new perspective on this card, which was really interesting. More of the esoteric. I tend to look at this card as like a pope and very religious, and religious in a particular context, and that gave me a whole new outlook on the card in general, which was kind of neat. So whether the two acolytes, so I'll just hold up the card again for you all. So whether the two acolytes are being admitted to the church or to an occult society, they are still entering a doctrine with a set of beliefs which they must learn and accept before they can gain entrance. Makes sense, right? We can see the Hierophant as a companion to the Emperor. The word pope means father, and like the Roman emperor, the pope is seen as a wise father guiding his children. Together, they share responsibility for humanity, the one providing physical needs, that would be the emperor, and the other guiding spiritual growth, which totally makes sense. So this explains why one of the things that I always struggled with before was that I viewed both cards through the lens of authority and authority figures, but I couldn't quite pinpoint where the differences were. I could feel the differences when I would do a reading, but it was harder for me to articulate that difference, and that gave me the language for it, which was really cool. Let's see. Okay, there must be a train. Y'all, I had a train in a previous video, and I was like, there's no train here. There's got to be a train somewhere so that at night I can hear. I don't even know if you guys can pick it up on the microphone. Somebody said ghost train, and I kind of giggled because I'm sure I've heard it before, but I've only noticed it since I've been filming. Anyways, sorry, random side rail, or side note, or derail, or I knew what I meant. All right, so let's see, where was I? Oh, here we go. Okay, so originally, the special function of the priests was evident. They spoke to the gods through the oracles, an often terrifying practice, and most people quite happily let someone else do it for them. And that makes perfect sense. That would have been the role of the priest in that situation. When Christianity rejected such graphic and immediate connection to God, the idea of the priest became, like the emperor, more abstract. So this makes sense why the lines suddenly got blurred for us, because there was a time when there were spiritual leaders, spiritual teachers, priests, priestesses, etc., that would have been conduits directly to the divine, whereas now we see those figures as being representative of a greater structure or authority system, not just one step away from God or goddess or the divine, which is really an interesting perspective. And then here, perhaps the interpretation of the Hierophant as representing secret doctrines suits our age better, for then the doctrine does not tell us what to do, but instead gives us direction to begin working on ourselves. So this is an interesting take on the Hierophant, where we look at it and go, okay, if we look at it from the idea of somebody who is just one step away from the divine, then there's somebody that helps us take personal responsibility and work on ourselves, not necessarily somebody that's just telling us what to do. Well, okay, so I pretty much just said the same thing that the book said, but the book said it more articulately, so there you go. And this piece really sort of stood out to me in a big way, so I'll share this in a moment. In the Waite-Smith imagery, no veil, because I'm going to hold this back up, there's still two pillars, which I don't think I'd really noticed before. So there's still two pillars, but it says no veil blocks the entrance to the church, as in the temple of the high priestess, but the pillars are a dull gray. Those who enter here may receive protection from personal choice, but they will not pierce the secrets of duality. And what stood out to me here, and I wrote it in the margin here, was avoiding responsibility for decisions. Now this really stood out to me because sometimes it's really appealing to hand over our power, because then we're not responsible for anything bad that might go wrong. Just like we're maybe not taking credit for the good, we're definitely not having to take credit for the bad either. Going. There we go. We'll see. We'll see how it processes in the end. But if it freezes a couple times, I'm real sorry. So anyway, I thought that was really, really, really interesting. And the idea of absolving myself of responsibility just really resonated. Because I could see the appeal of that and of handing over the power in that context. Okay, sorry. Back to text. In reading the cards, the card signifies churches, doctrines, and education in general. Psychology. Sorry, I'm gonna I know this is probably insufferable. Please feel free to fast forward through this part, and maybe I'm probably not gonna have time to edit it out, but if I could just figure out, there we go. Okay, I think I've got all background processes sort of shut down right now, but you never know. So hopefully we're good. Hopefully we're good. Okay, so I'm gonna try to zip through this. I think that's about it from this book. Oh, this part was interesting, though. There are many people who have given up the dogma forced on them as children, fall into some new dogma, like a cult or some extremist political group, just as rigid and perhaps more shallow. Having rejected tradition, they have not really rejected the Hierophant. They have not accepted the responsibility of truly finding their own way. So that really felt powerful to me to read. So, a couple little tidbits from Rachel Pollack's, I almost said 78 Degrees of Wisdom. Sorry, I already said this was Rachel Pollack. I'm all flustered now because my camera was freezing. Okay. Melissa Sanova's Kitchen Table Tarot. So, our action phrase for the Hierophant here at the bottom is, I am unlocking. I am unlocking. And this really was the interesting tidbit that stood out to me from Melissa Sanova's book. She says, I read something that likened the Hierophant. So she was having trouble connecting to this card, and she talks about that. And then she said she read something that likened the Hierophant to the trickster gods. What's this? You don't say. Coyote, Hermes, Jesus, Fox, Anansi, Loki, those are my boys. They take information that we can't quite wrap our heads around and make it discernible. The trickster is the messenger between the gods and man, stealing fire, teaching us forbidden secrets, and giving us an apple. Which I thought was a really cool take on it. So if you're struggling to see the Hierophant in more of the context that we typically see him as, which is this very kind of stiff religious figure, that's an interesting take that could be dove into. Me and tenses, not so good all the time. So the other thing she mentions here is that the important things in this card are the crossed keys at his feet. That's what matters. You don't just get them handed to you. You have to earn them. You don't just get to assume you know everything. And the Hierophant is a teacher. He represents a group or class and is an authority. He comes to us as a means to an end, a pathway to gain the education that lets you live your most authentic life. So this is a very positive look at the Hierophant, which I appreciate. Inverted, the Hierophant is any person who is right because they say so, inflexible and unforgiving. And she actually likens the Hierophant in this reversed or shadowed context to Agatha Trunchbull from the movie Matilda, which, if you haven't seen, is just an amazing example of somebody who is like dictating right and wrong, whether or not she's right. And she actually put the quote in the book, which is, at one point, Agatha Trunchbull is basically accusing Matilda of placing a newt in her water. And she says, besides, even if you didn't do it, I'm going to punish you because I'm big and you're small and I'm right and you're wrong and there's nothing you can do about it. And she goes on. So that's exactly the energy of that shadowed Hierophant as according to Melissa Sanova. So that was pretty cool. Some neat tidbits in there about the trickster, and I liked her interpretation of the shadow of the Hierophant. But what really tipped my understanding of the Hierophant on its head and really resonated with me was Benebell Wen's book, Holistic Tarot. Now, it's worth mentioning that the descriptions in these two books is a lot more along the lines of what I was already familiar with, which is sort of like the doctrine and the dogma in the light or in the upright meaning, and then the sort of misuse of that power or authority in the shadowed meaning. But Benebell takes it in a slightly different direction that felt much more true to me personally. So she looks at, here's what I took from it, and I'm not sure if this is her meaning, but this is definitely what resonated for me. She takes the Hierophant in its upright meaning as shadow. At least that's how I interpret it. And his reversed meaning, or his shadowed meaning, is actually where the light shows. Again, at least for me personally. And I'll see if this will make more sense as I read you a couple tidbits. So she says, Key 5, the Hierophant. The Hierophant card suggests conformity as a prevailing impulse. To conform, one must repress certain aspects of oneself that are different from others. Hence, the Hierophant card is also about concealment. It can represent deception, the concealment or distortion of truths. It can suggest a good intention to protect, but a negative result from those good intentions, because a person should never assume that he or she knows better than another and therefore try to protect or shield someone else from knowledge. Knowledge should be accessible to all. And I've skipped some bits in there, but that's sort of the whole piece that I have put together. So interesting, she also has here that the Hierophant also reminds the seeker that the pressure to conform may cause stigma. Individuals should be free to be their true selves. With the pressure to conform comes persecution, often unfair persecution of others who have chosen not to conform. Thus, there is a dark undertone to the Hierophant. And this really solidifies in a lot of ways the way that I relate to or with the Hierophant. So that was really powerful for me to read and felt very validating. Upright, the Hierophant represents orthodoxy, conforming to what is the present norm, membership to the majority or in the majority, and having the approval of those in power. Now, all of those things can feel really good, and in the right context could be nurturing and healthy. That hasn't always been my personal experience, and so the way that she expresses this upright meaning feels very neutral and accessible to me. The Hierophant represents heterodoxy, which I have no idea what that means. I could intimate it, but I have no idea. To be in the minority, to go against the norm, and to be unconventional. Oh, I'm sorry, reversed. Note that in the reverse, the Hierophant represents heterodoxy, to be in the minority, to go against the norm, and to be unconventional. And then she does do another comparison, and here she compares the Hierophant with the High Priestess, which we noted that comparison earlier also in the 78 Degrees of Wisdom. But here's what Benabel has to say. The High Priestess, key 2, the High Priestess, is associated with the mystical or metaphysical possession of wisdom and divine knowledge. Key 5, the Hierophant, is about the pedagogy of wisdom and divine knowledge. The Hierophant denotes ecclesiastical authority. If key 5 represents the orthodox, then key 2, the High Priestess, represents the heterodox. In other words, she represents your own personal authority and sovereignty, whereas the Hierophant represents an external authority. Sorry, I'm just kind of hovering over my dog, but he's good. He's good. So reversed, the Hierophant indicates nonconformity. This card in reverse is about seeking freedom and liberation from conformity. The seeker takes the unconventional path through life. So again, both the upright and the reversed, she's written in a very neutral way, so you could see either, I suppose, in light or shadow. Now, because I don't read reversals, I look at light and shadow based on the context of the reading, the question, the position if I'm using a layout, and its relationship to other cards around it. But this made me feel finally like somebody understood my relationship with the Hierophant. So that was really powerful, and definitely the first time I think that I've seen some definitions that don't necessarily fully agree with one another. And in that, there was some power for me, and that kind of makes sense in a way, just in the way that she's written about the Hierophant. Benabel has stepped away from the conformity that we might see in some of these other books. Not to say that either of these authors are conforming. They're obviously going with what makes sense to them. And even really, Melissa Sanova and her sort of interpretation of the Hierophant as a trickster also breaks from conformity. So each interpretation of the card is really unique, but I really enjoyed and appreciated having that more neutral take that made sense for me personally in Benabel's book. So I was really excited about that. So let's see. Let's look at some cards, and then I will share some personal experiences. So first we're going to look at the classic. This is the Rider-Waite Centennial. And thanks again to Kathy, because I now have a full size, not the little mini. So again, we see the two supplicants. We see the crossed keys. Do we see the crossed keys? Yes, they're right there at the base. I can't really see it very well in my preview, but yes. And we have this very traditional image of the Hierophant. So next I have the Hierophant from the Textured Tarot. And you'll find that most of my Hierophants are Hierophants I like, because this is one of those cards that I don't think I realized until now defines whether or not I will gel with a deck, because this is a very defining card in my own personal life, defining energy in my own personal life. And as a result, I didn't realize until I was pulling cards for this that most Hierophant cards I own, in decks that I own, are cards that make me feel comfortable, with just one or two exceptions, which I'll talk about. But anyway, the Textured Tarot. Now in the Textured Tarot, we see a gentleman who looks very spiritual, but he doesn't specifically look like a pope or a monk or anything like that. But you can tell he's in a building that looks like a cathedral. So it sets the tone for that religious structure for sure. He looks like he's somebody that comes from a school of tradition. And that was really interesting. And I just realized I forgot a very important card, but I will talk about it. So I'm going to talk about it before I forget. This week I've actually been working with the Raven's Prophecy Tarot, which is a new deck to me. And the Hierophant card in that deck actually threw me at first, because it's a picture of a lantern. So you know the typical lantern that we see the hermit carry? It's like a carry lantern with the flame inside of glass, like that. The Hierophant card in Raven's Prophecy is actually a picture close up of just one of those lamps. And again, at first I was thrown, but it talks about the sort of light of spiritual knowledge being put in a capsule or in a container that can be more easily passed from hand to hand, which really speaks of tradition. And I thought that was a really cool take. I'm sorry that I forgot to bring the card into my pile, but it is worth looking at the image online if you get a chance, if you don't own the deck. So the next Hierophant card I have to show you is from my new Journey to the Hidden Realms deck. And I adore this particular Hierophant. He looks like a wise, druidic, spiritual teacher. I recognize that he is Fae in this image, but he feels very comforting and accessible to look at. He does not feel threatening at all. And somebody that I could see myself wanting to learn from and respecting as an elder in whatever tradition he is a part of. So I really enjoyed this image. The next one is another personal favorite, and you all will understand why, I'm sure. So this is from the Everyday Witch Tarot, and we see the Hierophant here as a teacher of meditation. In my head, though, of course, she is teaching yoga. That's how I see her. It may not be what she's doing, but she is, of course, in the lotus pose there, which is, by the way, a pose that not everybody can nor should do, and that's a whole other rant for another day. But as I am also a yoga teacher, this gave me a really cool take on the Hierophant and on the idea of passing knowledge. And because my experience as a yoga teacher has been very empowering and very powerful, this was a really cool interpretation for me to play with. So next I have the Hierophant from the Wild Unknown. And I truly enjoy this image as well. Of course, the animals make this card or this whole deck really much more accessible. But when I first picked this up, I really get that image of, yeah, I've got the key and you're going to have to work to get it. It doesn't feel, it still conveys that message to me of you're going to need to learn and you're going to need to dedicate yourself to something in order to access this information or this knowledge. It might be just out of your reach until I choose to give it to you. So there's a lot for me to play with in this image. So next we have the Hierophant from Anna K. Tarot. My computer will not freeze, or my laptop, rather I can't talk today, my webcam. Maybe it will even focus if I'm real lucky. Come on. Okay, well, oh, there we go. If I just stay still, it would actually focus. Anyways, we have here another very religious figure looking dude, only he's called the High Priest. Now, he's called the High Priest, but he's just as rigid feeling to me as the traditional Hierophant. He feels just as cool and distant, I think is the way I want to express it. So yeah, I appreciate that he's called the High Priest, but the name change does nothing for me as far as changing the energy of the card, except perhaps it makes it more accessible for some. So next I'm going to show you the Wildwood Tarot, and I really think this is an interesting take. So this is the Ancestor. Focus. Come on, I try to be still. Dude. Anyway, there we go. It's kind of trying. I know it's still blurry. I'm sorry. But it features this really cool figure. Maybe it's my hand. Sorry, I just bumped the whole camera. Maybe it's my hand and fingers that are messing it up. Anyways, we see this really cool figure who is not human nor animal, but some hybrid of the two. And this feels very much more like that sacred initiation kind of energy. Somebody who might be holding space and knowledge of a deep esoteric tradition. So I think that's pretty cool. This is a one that's a bit more difficult, but shows the energy of the Hierophant how I perceive it most of the time. And this is from the Deviant Moon Borderless. So we see a religious figure here, and if you look closely, see if my camera will focus on this dude, there's a little guy in his pocket. Yeah, it's not going to focus very well today. I don't know. It's just not going to cooperate. But there's a little dude right here in his pocket. And that really speaks to me anyway about the idea that sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second there. It speaks to me of the idea of being sort of, there's sort of like a puppeteer kind of energy, or definitely a control. Like this figure has this other guy in his pocket and can kind of manipulate him however he wants. So that shows a bit more of the shadow side for me. This one also speaks to shadow, and I don't know if I think it's his face. But this is from the Bonefire. Nope. Yeah, Bonefire. That's right. Oh, look, it focused for me. Isn't that nice? This guy just seems really, really rigid and unforgiving and intense. So it really gives me that same energy that I'm used to perceiving in the Hierophant. Love this image from my newly trimmed, watch for a video to come up about that soon, Everyday Enchantments Tarot. We have again a teacher here clearly teaching what I would assume is some sort of spiritual, what is it, like a religious studies course almost? You can see behind him the symbols from all the different religions. Maybe not all of them, but definitely some of them. And all of these people just listening intently. So this again puts off a more nurturing style energy, more of the neutral or teacher type interpretation, which I really enjoy. This is probably the most empowering, personally empowering Hierophant card that I have in my collection, and this is from the Star Child Tarot by Danielle Noel. So here we see a figure. I think it looks a little more washed out in my viewfinder there, but she is holding a ball of energy, or at least that's how I perceive it. And to me, she is her own teacher. She is her own authority when it comes to connecting with spirit, and I appreciate that interpretation quite a lot. Okay, so I've put these last two cards together at the end on purpose because one is very difficult and one is very nice. So first the difficult one, and I'm sure this won't come as any surprise to you, but this is the Hierophant from the Mary L. Tarot. And this card very, very specifically challenges me and makes me feel things, because this in a lot of ways really represents my own personal experience with Hierophant energy in my life in the not good ways. So this card really to me represents the idea of obedience and somebody in a way almost, even though this looks to be someone feeding two childrenish kind of creatures, I get this impression that instead of nourishing them, she is draining them. She is pulling their attention and their adoration as a source of energy and fuel for herself. And maybe that's not the intention of this card, but it is what it makes me feel. And I think that that's important for my own personal work, but it's difficult for me for sure. And finally, a little light and a little fluff. We have our absolutely adorable Crystal Unicorn Hierophant with all the same symbology as the Rider-Waite version, but just in a softer, less intimidating way, because unicorn and unicorns are amazing teachers. And my camera just finally came back into focus. That's awesome. Anyway, so I really liked this. This was our little palette cleanser card after the difficult stuff. But all of those cards have very different interpretations, but most of them, with the exception of the Deviant Moon, the Bonefire, and the Crystal Unicorn Tarot, feel really accessible to me for different reasons. But even that said, having dove, that is the right way to say that, right? Having dove into this card this week and really examined it and looked at it in my relationship with it, I definitely feel like I can look at all of these a little bit differently now and bring my own personal interpretation to the table, which is really great. So I've written down some notes so I remember what I wanted to share with you, because I have the memory of a sieve. But so thinking about the Hierophant in light, so if we just discard the idea of upright and reversed for a moment, for me the light side of the Hierophant is when I am walking my own path, free from the pressure to conform. Now there's a certain degree of conformity that I see as healthy from day to day as far as interacting with the rest of the world. And then there's the kind of conformity that feels stifling, where you are literally suppressing your own truth of who you are in order to be accepted or liked. So for me, the light side is when I am really breaking free of that idea. And on a slightly deeper level, the everyday way that I experience the light side of the Hierophant is by consciously breaking free of the patterns I learned as a child about authority, which relates more to the idea, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, but when it came to my childhood, there was an expectation of obedience in an environment where that was not necessarily the truth, nor was the truth nurtured or really drawn out. So the idea of obedience in this context is tightly linked with Hierophant energy for me personally. So for me, when I'm in the light side or the light energy of the Hierophant, I'm not falling back into step just for the sake of obedience. I hope that makes sense to you all. For the shadow, where I really fall into that energy, the shadowed energy of the Hierophant, is the opposite of what I was just saying. It's when I get caught up in, oh, this person's an authority figure, I must obey, and I leave my free thinking and my gut feelings and my intuition to the side. And I know that's very similar to what I talked about with the Emperor, but it still is very true. My relationship with authority is a big part of my personal shadow work and my personal growth work, so it plays cards. But I find that when it comes to the Hierophant, the issues relate more to my childhood directly and the ways that I was influenced by the authority figure and figures that I grew up with. So when I'm really consciously moving in a healthy way away from those childhood patterns that don't serve me anymore, that's when I'm really in the light. And when I get caught up in those old patterns, that's really when I'm in the shadow of the Hierophant. So I wanted to share my big light moment. Difficult. So I don't know if light is even the right term. Maybe neutral, maybe aha, maybe breakthrough. But there was a point in my life when I stepped out of the line of conformity within the context of a pagan witchy group that I was involved with. And I was closely involved, and I've alluded to this in the past, and I may have even mentioned this story. I hope I'm not repeating. But again, memory of a sieve. So if I am, I'm sorry. But there was a point where I very consciously stepped out of my comfort zone, which was to fall in line. My comfort zone at that point in my life was to be the yes girl, the obedient girl, the one who went along with what everybody wanted to do. And there was a point when in this group of people that I genuinely really, really cared for, I felt that the person in leadership, who was the high priestess of our group, was abusing her power and doing so in a subtle and not so subtle interpersonal way that was hurtful to the people who saw her as a friend, not just a high priestess. And so there was a point when I stepped away from the conformity of that group and what was happening, and I said, no, this isn't okay. And I did it in a very, for me at the time, brave way. I don't know that I did it in the best way. I wouldn't say that. I think, though, that it was the first time that I really publicly and powerfully stood up to somebody who was in a position of power in my life personally. And she was somebody who was an authority figure, a spiritual authority figure, no less, in my own personal life. And I stood up and said, no, this isn't okay. The fallout of that experience was immense. I lost many friends. I was essentially booted from this community group. It was really painful, and people that I had gotten very, very close with watched it happen. And there were a couple people who are still friends today who didn't just watch it happen, who at the very least did not choose sides in this scenario, or who I don't want to qualify best and worst, but there were people that didn't choose sides, and then there were people who also sort of stood up for me, and either of those choices meant something to me at the time, something really powerful at the time about also stepping out of conformity. And that is not an easy thing to do when you're dealing with any kind of spiritual leadership, or any kind of leadership, to be honest. And in particular, the way that this impacted my entire social life at the time, which was almost exclusively with this group of people, was incredibly huge. And it was the beginning of a long string of, or not a long string, but I guess a long run of very deep, dark, shadow work that was really powerful and transformative in my own life. But the reason that this is such an important story for me is because it was the beginning of me finding my own authority. It was the beginning of me really discovering my own personal power, and in recognizing that I didn't have to follow somebody to be spiritual. And I think that was really a huge turning point for me. And it does remain a piece of my past that makes it difficult sometimes for me to work in groups at all, because there's a certain triggering possibility whenever anybody starts to step into that position of authority, perceived or in actuality. So I do find that I am the most comfortable now in solitary work, and that's no one's fault. It's just where I really flourish, because I can personally work on my own sovereignty and my own authority in ways that are really, really healthy and powerful for me. So that is my big one to share, my big story. So before we close out, I want to leave you with a couple of questions for contemplation. Again, these come out of the book Journaling the Tarot, a little book of big questions by Andy Matzner. You can find that on Amazon, I believe, I have it the Kindle version of the book, but you can also, I think, find a print copy as well. So the questions I picked for this week for the Hierophant. First, what past or current traditions, I added the or current, have you felt the need to rebel against? 2, what is something you would like to teach other people, and how might you go about doing so? 3, who can help you learn something you really need to know? And 4, who have been your role models? What was it about each one that was attractive or inspirational? So if you want, you can have those questions to mull over or to journal about in your own exploration of your relationship with the Hierophant. Next week, we get to dive into the Lovers, which will probably feel a little lighter. This week was pretty heavy for me working with the Hierophant energy, and I am really looking forward to diving into some love. Okay, well, maybe not literally. I guess we'll find out. Some love, though, with the Lovers. And with that, I'm going to close out this week's Tarot Memoirs. I hope you have a beautiful day wherever you are, and I hope to see you all again very, very soon. Thanks so much. Bye!